Hey comic fans, welcome back. Dave here at Ground Zero talking all things comics and all things comics history. You know, the 1990s was, to put it mildly, a very interesting decade. It was absolutely explosive in terms of quantity, if not always necessarily quality. There were a lot of new superhero universes that popped up throughout the decade, but most of them really were just knockoffs, largely regurgitating work that had been done by earlier creators in previous decades. Most, that is, but not all. There were some notable exceptions. And one of these was a company formed by four passionate creators who saw a lack of racial diversity in the comics work being done around them at the time. Now, these creators wanted to address what they saw as an obvious need by creating a superhero universe that was unlike anything else being published at the time. Now, the company only published comics for about 4 years, and so it's largely seen as another casualty of the speculator boom and bust of the 90s. But it was not a flash in the pan. In fact, some of its characters continue to pop up today, guest starring in print media and in video games and TV shows. It really is an interesting company that had a great vision. And so we're going to talk about that in this segment of Interestingly Enough. Now, today's topic was actually suggested to me by Douglas Valenzuela, who writes in, "Can we do something about Milestone comics?" I really loved that line, and to me, it was flawless. And can we also go into Dwayne McDuffie a little bit? Well, Douglas, thank you so much for writing in. I really appreciate you watching. So yes, absolutely, Dwayne McDuffie and Milestone were pretty important to comics history in the 1990s. But as important as they were, I'm not going to start with either one of them because we're actually going to start with comics artist Denys Cowan. Now, from a very, very young age, Denys Cowan had a love of all things art, a love that he got directly from his mother. Now, sadly, by the time he was in the 3rd grade, his mother had passed away. And he was left to his grandmother, who worked multiple jobs trying to make ends meet and take care of him and his siblings. So 3rd grade, he's sitting at the back of the class alone as always, retreating in his art. And a kid comes down and sits next to him by the name of Derek T. Dingle. Now, Derek pulls out what is the first comic book that Denys has seen in his entire life. An issue of Jack Kirby's New Gods, one that featured the Black Racer. Denys sees this and is blown away. He is instantly hooked. He is in love. This is going to be his passion going forward. Like many of us, this really influenced his life. Well, it motivated him so much that he continued to work extra hard on his art, painting, drawing, anything he could get his hands on. Well, flash forward a couple of years. He's 14 years old and he's in the school lunchroom and he meets another kid. This one is working as an assistant to Marvel Comics artist Rich Buckler. Well, Denys did not lack in motivation or ambition or drive, and so he immediately goes to see Buckler himself and comes away with his own job as Buckler's assistant. Well, he's working, sharpening pencils, carrying out the trash, running errands, the things an assistant needs to do for an artist so the artist can do art. And Buckler is paying him actually in record albums, which coincidentally is exactly how I get paid here now that you mention it. So a year later, when Denys Cowan is 15 years old, he's working for Neil Adams at Continuity Comics, learning from one of the masters, and he's picking up all sorts of information on how comics are created and how to make his art better. His drive was unparalleled, so it would not be long before he was working as a penciler in the regular comic industry. And he did things like Power Man and Iron Fist for Marvel Comics, followed by really what was his defining run, the one that brought his name in front of the most people. A long stint with Denny O'Neil in DC Comics' The Question. It was this book that really kind of brought his name into focus for so many comic fans. And rose his star enough that when DC Comics was getting ready to do the 600th issue of Detective, right about the time of Batmania, the first Tim Burton Batman movie had hit, this was going to be an important and big deal. Who did they tab to do the lead feature? Denys Cowan. It was an excellent story, and it really made him a star to be reckoned with. Okay, well, we're going to leave Denys Cowan for just a moment then, because now it's time to talk about Dwayne McDuffie. Because about this time, McDuffie had graduated basically with a degree in English and a master's in physics. Think about that. An English major with a master's in physics. If this doesn't scream, I want a career in comics, I don't know what does. Well, by the 80s, he was working as an assistant editor for Marvel, doing all sorts of things. He was instrumental in their first trading card superhero line, and he also did some writing on his own, including this series. Now, it's obscure, but it's actually pretty beloved. Damage Control, because when superheroes fight a supervillain across the city, leaving damage and rubble in their wake, or if they take down a giant robot in Midtown Manhattan, who cleans up the mess? It's these guys. You're going to have to search through some bargain bins to find it, but it's well worth looking for. It's a lot of fun. He did a couple of these series, well remembered by fans of that period. Now, in addition to being a writer and working as an editor, he was a champion of diversity. And by 1989, he was kind of frustrated with what was going on around him. Now, Marvel brought back a couple of characters, including a few that maybe didn't deserve to be brought back, like, say, this guy, Rocket Racer, African-American on a cool yellow skateboard. He was appearing again in the Spider-Man comics. Over in Thor, they were introducing the New Warriors and Night Thrasher and his cosmic-powered skateboard. Well, by McDuffie's reckoning, this was a quarter of the black superhero characters that Marvel was publishing, all on skateboards. And that motivated him to make this pitch to Marvel Comics. It was a pitch for a title he was going to call Teenage Negro Ninja Thrashers. Oh yeah, because as he says, obviously this is what Marvel Comics wants. So he promised not one, not two, but four black guys with skateboards, led by that mysterious black guy with a skateboard. He promised clothing and hairstyles circa 1974. And bear in mind, this was 1989. He promised, what obviously Marvel Comics wanted, bizarre speech patterns unrecognizable by any member of any culture on the planet. Because let's face it, most of these books were written by people who had no concept of what these characters would actually be talking like on the streets. But did I mention cosmic-powered skateboards? This might have actually been fun under Dwayne McDuffie, but it was never intended as a serious pitch. He had a point to make, and he made it. But he knew that he had work to do and probably would not be able to do all that he wanted at Marvel Comics. Well, luckily the 90s hits. Unluckily for some. But it worked out for some other people because new superhero universes were popping up like a bad case of acne right before prom. They were everywhere. And this was opportunity. So Dwayne McDuffie gets with three other professionals. Michael Davis, Derek T. Dingle, the same Derek Dingle that introduced Denys Cowan to New Gods, and then Denys Cowan himself. And together they form Milestone Media. Milestone Media has a mission, and that mission is racial diversity. So they go to DC Comics and work out what at the time is an unprecedented deal. They were going to pay DC Comics a flat fee of $500,000 to $650,000. DC, for its part, would print, distribute, and license their books. That's all. Everything else belonged to Milestone. They controlled all copyrights. They controlled the creative output and merchandising. This was important. Paul Levitz was sympathetic to what they were doing, and he was impressed with their ambition and their drive. Now, Dwayne McDuffie had a plan. I mean, his plan was everything to him. Because as he said in an interview at the time, he phrased it, if you do a black character or a female character or an Asian character, then they aren't just that character. They represent that race or that sex, and they can't even be interesting because everything they do has to represent an entire block of people. He goes on, Superman isn't all white people, and neither is Lex Luthor. We knew we had to present a range of characters within each ethnic group, which means that we couldn't do just one book. We had to do a series of books, and we had to present a world that's wider than the world we've seen before. End quote. That was his mission, and to do it, they had a plan. All books were going to take place in the Dakotaverse, named that because it's centered around the fictional Dakota City. And their first year, their plan was to introduce 4 books with 4 distinctive new characters. February 23rd, 1993, the first one arrives in comic shops. Hardware, written by McDuffie himself and drawn by Denys Cowan. And look, it comes in a poly bag. Because, did I mention this was the 90s? And it has a trading card in it, because it's the 90s. And it has a print run of 300,000 copies. Again, because it's the 90s, and it almost sold out its print run within the first week. It actually did pretty well. Sadly, these numbers would prove to drop as time went on. They followed this up with their next book, Blood Syndicate, which turned out to be probably their most controversial book. And then followed that one in May with Icon. Now, Icon was essentially their Superman character. But what's interesting about this is this book, along with Blood Syndicate, had to appear without the Comics Code seal of approval. Now, that was due mostly to language and racial epithets that were in the book. And this was kind of important because Dwayne McDuffie was satisfied that DC let them do the books as they needed to do them. They stayed out of it, even though Milestone presented a lot of storylines that a conservative staid company like DC was pretty uncomfortable with. They upheld their end, and that meant a lot to Milestone. Well, in June, they introduced the 4th and final of their initial titles, and that is Static. And hey, look, once again, polybagged. It was the 90s. Enjoy. Anyway, this was their final initial title, and it was probably their most lighthearted, if such could be said about a book of these natures. It was about a geeky 15-year-old named Virgil Hawkins. Now, the name Virgil Hawkins comes from an actual person, an African-American who fought for 9 years to attend the University of Florida College of Law. He fought and fought to attend. He kept taking it to court, and he kept winning. But every time he'd win, he'd go back, and they still wouldn't let him in. After 9 years, he finally agreed to withdraw his submission if they would change the rules to allow minorities in their school. That's who this kid was named after. Now, despite being more street than anything DC was certainly publishing, it was the most lighthearted of their books, and he gave lots of quips as he fought, just like Spider-Man did, which probably endeared this to more comic readers of the time. And so really, of all of their books, this is probably the one that's most fondly remembered today. Now, he was, like several members of Blood Syndicate and a lot of the other characters in this universe, one of the Bang Babies. Now, the Bang Babies had their own origin of how these characters got their powers, and it was inspired by an actual 1985 event in Philadelphia where the police actually bombed an almost entire neighborhood trying to take out a black liberation group. Not the kind of thing you read about in school, but it's on the internet. Go take a look. It was this kind of stuff that formed the universe they were trying to present in Milestone Comics. Also, that same first year, in 1993, they had their own trading card set. Basically, Milestone, the Dakota universe. And if it's in the 90s and you got your own trading card set, you're on your way. Well, the next year rolls around. And even though the book sales are starting to get kind of shaky, they're expanding their line. And they're expanding their diversity. We get Zombie, a Korean American. Now, this book is drawn by Denys Cowan, and already we're getting away from just African Americans because they want full representation in their universe. And then this one is followed by Cobalt, a much more violent character, a lot like the Punisher from Marvel, but in his case, of Cuban descent. Again, they are determined to be diverse. Well, that same year, Dwayne McDuffie was talking with Louise Simonson. Now, Louise Simonson was writing Steel. Dwayne McDuffie was writing Hardware, an African-American in a suit of power armor. That was his special powers. Simonson was writing Steel, sounding kind of similar, a African-American in a power suit of armor. Well, Despite the fact that they had similar powers, they were very different characters. And so Simonson and McDuffie thought, wouldn't it be great to do a 90s? Because this was the 90s, so we have to do a crossover. And so that's exactly what they did. And they went to Paul Levitz, who actually liked the idea and said, why not expand it to the entire Superman family of books? We'll cross Steel and Hardware over, we'll cross Icon and Superboy, and of course, Icon and Superman are a natural fit. So we got all of those books. Hardware featured Steel, Steel featured Hardware, Icon meets Superman. And the hope was that this would actually give them a little bit of sales boost because their numbers were already starting to fall. And this culminated in a gigantic one-shot. All of these books actually did provide a sales bump. They did pretty well initially, many of them going into second printings, and they desperately needed this. However, as soon as this crossover was done, their numbers started returning back to a fairly tepid number. And this was unfortunate. As Denys Cowan said kind of at the time, he was really kind of surprised at the resistance they got in the direct market. It just seemed like comic shops across America really weren't all that ready for a line of superheroes with this much racial diversity. But despite all that, they were going to plug ahead. They had a mission, and their deal with DC allowed them to do things that other companies couldn't do. So they were going to stick to their guns, and they were going to succeed as long as there wasn't a major catastrophic event that would just clobber the comic industry. Unfortunately, there was a major cataclysmic, catastrophic event that clobbered the industry. And if you've seen my earlier one, oh look, it's Icon right there. Yes, the great comic industry crash of the mid-90s was just right around the corner. Now, they had to immediately cancel some of their lower selling books. Cobalt was gone, Zombie was gone, but they plugged ahead. Hardware would ultimately make it 50 issues, Icon would make it 42, Static would make it 45 issues. They were determined to do what they could to survive the 90s, and that's a trick that a lot of companies couldn't do. Well, they had their work cut out for them because in 1996, with the industry sales in freefall and comic shops all across America closing like crazy, Marvel and DC were pulling out their biggest guns to try to take whatever was left of the comic book market. Marvel Comics did Onslaught, a major epic that's still remembered pretty well today, that just almost succeeded in destroying the Marvel Universe, and followed up with Heroes Reborn, where they got a bunch of key image artists, the biggest stars of the decade, Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, to do books for them and reinterpret their core characters. The Fantastic Four, the Avengers, Thor, Iron Man, all had the image look to them, and they sold in buckets. Comic shops ordered cases of these books, which didn't leave a lot of money left over to order Milestone books. Not to be outdone, DC married Superman and Lois Lane, a major event that they had to reserve for times when they desperately needed it. And comic shops ordered cases and cases of these books, which didn't leave a lot of money left over for Milestone books. But they're not done. The event comic fans have been waiting for really since 1961, DC versus Marvel. It was a fanboy's dream, and comic shops ordered cases and cases of these books, which didn't leave a lot of money left over for companies like Milestone. You might see a trend here. Sure enough, Milestone was not going to make it out of the 90s. They plugged ahead as much as they could. Hardware did survive just long enough to hit issue 50, but in 1997 they had no choice but to shut down their comic division. And that's exactly what they did. Now, Milestone Media continued as a company that was concerned mainly with media ventures and licensing. But sadly, Dwayne McDuffie would pass away in 2011, complications after some emergency heart surgery. Which brings us really to how we view Milestone Comics. Now, people who don't really know the story or haven't paid much attention tend to view it as a failure, just another casualty of the speculator boom and bust. But it's really a lot more than that. As writer-artist Damian Duffy said, and I'm quoting him to some degree, Milestone didn't fail. Comics failed Milestone in much the same way that comics failed female readership. For decades, the myth in the American comic industry was girls don't read comics. But then manga exploded in the early 2000s, and we saw that myth for what it was. It wasn't that girls don't read comics. It's that you're not making comics that girls want to read. And that's important. And ultimately, we have a different situation now, and that can be attributed to work of people like Dwayne McDuffie. And ultimately, that is Milestone and Dwayne McDuffie's legacy. If you write comics for a narrow margin of people, that is industry suicide. If a Jack Kirby comic can influence and motivate and change the life of a third grader sitting at the back of class, then you have something important. There should be comics for anyone who will be inspired by them. And I'm going to leave you with that. Man, this one came out longer than I thought. Guys, I appreciate you sticking with me for the whole 20 minutes. Thank you so much. Please, give us some love. Don't forget the 3 S's. Like, subscribe, and share. And those of you who have shared our videos, I really do appreciate it. Thank you very much. Guys, we will see you next time with a video that I promise will be less than 20 minutes. Have a great day, everybody.